The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray long before the rain began, but when the storm finally broke, it came with a ferocity that rattled the little town to its bones. Daniel Carter tightened his grip on his daughter Lily's small hand as they stepped out of his modest auto shop, his worn work boots splashing through the forming puddles. He had just locked up after another long day of patching up cars, his hands still marked with grease and his body heavy with fatigue, but there was no rest to be found under the angry sky. The wind howled through the empty streets, bending the trees and tossing loose debris around like playthings. Lightning cracked overhead, and Lily jumped, her wide brown eyes clinging to her father for comfort. "Don't worry, sweet pea," Daniel murmured, tucking her raincoat tighter around her thin frame, "we'll be home soon." Just as he began guiding her toward the truck parked down the block, a sharp cry pierced the storm. At first he thought it was the wind carrying some eerie echo, but then he heard it again, higher, more desperate, the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice calling for help. Daniel froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced down at Lily, who was trembling under the awning of the shop, and knew instantly what he had to do. "Stay here, sweetheart, don't move," he instructed firmly, crouching to meet her frightened gaze. "Daddy will be right back, I promise." Without waiting for her reply, he sprinted into the rain, the cold water soaking through his clothes within seconds. The cries led him down the block toward the edge of the road, where the storm had turned the ditch into a dangerous torrent of muddy water. There, half submerged, was a dark sedan, its headlights flickering weakly against the sheets of rain. Through the glass, he could see her, a woman trapped inside, pounding frantically on the window as the water crept higher, her face pale with terror. Adrenaline surged through Daniel's veins, driving him forward despite the fierce wind trying to shove him back. He reached the car, bracing himself against the current, and yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The woman's muffled voice cried out again, and Daniel shouted through the glass, "Hold on." With a grunt, he pressed his shoulder against the door, using every ounce of strength he had. The metal groaned, resisting him, but finally gave way with a sharp pop, nearly throwing him off balance. Cold water rushed out as he grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her into the storm's chaos, lifting her to safety as she gasped for air, clinging to him as though he were the only solid thing left in the world. For a moment, their eyes met, hers wide with shock and relief, his steady with determination, and in that fleeting exchange, something unspoken passed between them. She whispered a shaky, "Thank you," but before he could respond, the storm roared louder, reminding him that his daughter was still waiting under the awning, and that this night was only just beginning. Daniel half carried, half guided the woman back toward the auto shop, his arm steadying her trembling frame as the rain poured down harder, soaking them both to the bone. By the time they reached the awning where Lily stood waiting with wide, fearful eyes, Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, but relief washed over him as he saw his daughter safe. "Daddy!" Lily cried, rushing forward, her tiny hands clutching his soaked shirt before noticing the woman at his side. The stranger shivered violently, her lips pale and quivering, but she still managed a faint smile at the little girl before Daniel ushered them both inside. The shop was dark except for the weak glow of a single lamp in the corner, and the smell of motor oil clung to the air, but it was warm compared to the raging storm outside. Daniel grabbed a worn blanket from the shelf and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, then knelt to meet her gaze. "You're safe now," he reassured, his deep voice calm even though his heart was still hammering. "Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, her chest rising and falling as though the act of breathing itself was still a struggle, and then her voice broke through in a whisper. "Clara. Clara Hayes." Daniel nodded, the name not sparking recognition in his tired mind, but there was something about the way she said it, as though it should have meant something to him, that unsettled him. Lily, ever curious, peered around her father's arm and asked innocently, "Are you hurt, lady?" Clara's eyes softened at the child's concern, but then shifted back to Daniel with a strange intensity. "Daniel Carter," she murmured suddenly, her voice low but certain. The sound of his name on her lips made him stiffen. His brow furrowed as he leaned closer, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "How do you know my name?" he asked, suspicion and confusion tangled in his tone. Clara's expression was unreadable, her eyes studying every line of his face as if confirming something she had long wondered. "Because I've been looking for you," she replied quietly, her words nearly swallowed by the thunder outside. Daniel blinked in disbelief, shaking his head slightly. He had never seen her before in his life, of that he was sure. He was just a mechanic, a widowed father scraping by one paycheck at a time, and here was a stranger, a woman he dragged from a sinking car, speaking as though she had been searching for him all along. "There must be some mistake," he said finally, his voice gruff as he rose to his feet, though inside, unease gnawed at him. But Clara didn't argue. She simply pulled the blanket tighter around herself and watched him with knowing eyes, as though she held a truth he wasn't ready to hear. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the windows, but inside the shop the air was heavier still, not from thunder, but from the mystery of why a woman he'd never met before could speak his name with such certainty. The storm had quieted to a steady drizzle by the time Clara found her voice again, her hands still trembling under the blanket as she sat on the edge of the old couch in the shop, her eyes following Daniel's every move as he stoked the portable heater to chase away the damp chill. Lily had curled up with a coloring book, humming softly to herself, but even in her childlike distraction, she kept glancing curiously at the strange woman who seemed to know her father's name. Daniel finally broke the silence, his tone edged with the same wariness that had lingered since she'd spoken. "All right, Clara, you said you've been looking for me. Why? We've never met." Clara drew in a shaky breath, lowering her gaze to her clasped hands as if gathering courage. "We have," she said softly, "though you don't remember. Years ago, before I became who I am now, I was stranded on a country road. My car had died, my phone had no signal, and the night was colder than I expected. I thought I'd be stuck until morning, until a man pulled over, a little girl in a car seat behind him, and fixed my engine without hesitation. He wouldn't take a dime from me. He just smiled and told me, if you want to repay me, help someone else someday." She lifted her eyes then, and Daniel felt his stomach drop as fragments of memory tugged at him. He did remember a moment like that, long ago when Lily was barely more than a toddler. He had stopped for a stranger, patched up her car, and driven off, never thinking of it again. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsettled by how vividly her words matched that forgotten act of kindness. "That was you?" he muttered, almost to himself. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "That man changed me, Daniel. That night, I promised I'd honor his words. I never knew his name then, but I never forgot his face, or his daughter's laugh in the back seat." Daniel sat back heavily, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the frightened stranger he had just pulled from the storm. "But why search for me after all this time?" he asked, his voice quieter now, laced with reluctant curiosity. Clara's lips trembled into a smile that carried both gratitude and sorrow. "Because I did keep my promise. I built my life, my company, my success, all with the memory of that night pushing me forward. And when I finally learned your name, I wanted to thank you properly. But tonight, fate found a way before I could." Daniel stared at her, his chest tight, torn between disbelief and something he couldn't name. He had never expected his forgotten kindness to ripple back into his life, let alone in the form of a woman who claimed her world had been shaped by it. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself at a loss for words, caught in the quiet storm of truth swirling behind Clara's eyes. Days turned into weeks after the storm, and though Daniel tried to convince himself that Clara's sudden presence in his life was temporary, she kept returning, first to make sure his shop hadn't been damaged in the flood, then to drop off groceries when she noticed how bare the shelves were, and soon after, simply because she wanted to spend time with him and Lily. At first Daniel resisted, his pride bristling at the thought of accepting help from anyone, let alone a woman who had revealed herself to be Clara Hayes, the powerful CEO of Hayes Industries, a name he'd only seen on billboards and business magazines. Yet Clara never carried herself like someone trying to flaunt wealth or pity his struggles. Instead, she knelt beside Lily on the concrete floor to color with her, or brought homemade soup and laughed with genuine warmth as Daniel teased her about not knowing how to use a wrench. Little by little, the walls Daniel had built around his heart began to crack, not because Clara offered him anything material, but because she offered something rarer, understanding. One crisp autumn evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in fiery shades of orange, Clara arrived at the shop with a nervous smile and a box of pastries in her hands. Lily squealed with delight, wrapping her arms around her legs before darting off to play, leaving Clara standing awkwardly in front of Daniel. "You saved me twice, Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Once on that road years ago, and again in that storm. I've spent so long chasing success, but every time I looked at what I built, I remembered that night and your words, 'Help someone else.' I thought finding you was my way to close the circle, but maybe it's something more." Daniel's brow furrowed, his hands still stained with oil from the day's work as he studied her earnest face, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that seemed almost foreign on someone of her stature. "I don't want to just thank you, Daniel. I want to stand beside you. With you. With Lily. If you'll let me." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the chirping of crickets and Lily's laughter echoing from the back. Daniel's heart thudded painfully against his chest, a storm of doubt and longing clashing inside him, until finally he saw it, the sincerity in Clara's eyes, the way she looked not at what he lacked, but at who he was. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and whispered, "You deserve more than a man who's barely getting by." Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, her smile soft but unshakable. "I don't want more, Daniel. I want real. And that's you." For the first time in years, Daniel felt hope stir within him, fragile but undeniable. As the last light of day faded, he realized that what began with a storm might just be the beginning of something he thought he'd never have again, a family, rebuilt not by chance, but by love.